past self, present self, future self, what role does the identity play? How we think and speak to ourselves, what does that play in our ability to actually live those dreams?
It's huge. It's huge. I love what you're saying. So identity, kind of, when you ground it all down, it's basically two things. It's the, narrative, as you said, story narrative that's driving who you're being. But it's also that which you're most committed to as a person. And so past self, present self, future self is huge, because obviously we all have past selves. We are in the present, and we also have future selves. But what's really crucial to understand when it comes to psychology is that people think about their past self, present self, and future selves the same way that they look at time. And how people are trained to look at time is that it's something that's outside of us, and it's something that's sequential over time, meaning like the past is behind us, the present is now, and the future's up ahead of us. And that those three are independent spheres, and that they're actually different from one another. The thing about psychology is that that's not actually how it works. What we're kind of trained in psychology, not everyone, but like how I was trained in psychology to think about it is that time is not sequential, it's actually holistic. And so what that means is that who I'm being right now fundamentally is based on how I frame my past and also how I'm framing my future. Like a really good example of that is Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, very much talks about like when people lost hope in the future, the present became toxic. It became like honestly meaningless and hard to bear. And therefore, those conditions, Man's Search for Meaning being a discussion on the concentration camps, like people without a connection to their future ultimately like died in the present because they're, and so, he was just very adamant that you needed hope in the future. You needed a future to be striving for in order to have meaning in the present. But I just think a huge insight that I think is a really big starting point, and it kind of lays the foundation. And we can go deep on the identity side, even, however far you want to go on that before we go into the difference between 10x and 2x. But a common approach, and I think a trained approach that we have, especially here in Western culture, is to assume that the past is what's shaping the present, and to take the past and use that as the explanation for the present. That I am who I am because of my past. And that seems intuitive, but when it comes to psychology, it's the opposite way. It's the present that shapes the meaning of the past. And it always is that way. Even memory is a reconstruction. It's not a retrieval. You're not trying to retrieve files of past events. You're literally reconstructing them in the present. And so it's far more empowering, but it's also far more accurate to say that the present is what shapes the meaning of the past, and that you're always carrying the past with you. And that past is under constant revision or constant construction. And the more you know that, then the more you can let the present shape the past in useful ways, so that the past is an asset rather than a liability. So that's one. It's just that you're always carrying the past, but also then the opposite. With that knowledge, it's really important to realize you are not your past self. No one listening to this is their past self 10 years ago. I'll go as far as to say 10 days ago. And the more you get used to realizing that you're not the same person you were in the past, and get better and better at recognizing that, appreciating it, and even defining it, the more what we call flexible you become psychologically. And that's crucial for identity, because you don't want to overly be identified with your past self. Not that your past self is anyone wrong, but just that here I am now, I can actually recognize ways I'm different than who I was last week. And that there are certain things that I absolutely would not say yes to today that I would have said yes to a week ago. But the same is true of future, and I'll just lay this out, and then wherever you want to go with identity.
Great.
But just as people typically take the past and use that to frame the present, rather than the opposite way, we often take the present and we use that to frame the future. What I'm saying is what people typically do, and there's a lot of research on this. Harvard psychologist Daniel Gilbert, he did a lot of work on future self, is that people take the present and they use that to shape their view of their future self. The primary reason that they do that is that they lack the imagination to actually imagine a different future self, which is actually accurate. If you use the past, you recognize that you're not the same person you were in the past. The same will be true in the future. Your future self, very different from who you are. And so what you want to do psychologically, given that time is holistic psychologically, that the past, present, and future are all happening right now, is you want your future to be the dictator of who you are in the present. That's letting your future self decide who you are and what you do. So you let the future determine the present, and you always let the present determine the past. And this allows a lot more psychological flexibility, where I'm not my past self, but also pretty wildly and ridiculously, I'm also not my present self. Who I am in the present moment, as Daniel Gilbert would say, is as fleeting as the present moment. Therefore, I don't have to defend my current self or my past self, because I know that my future self will be different. And so you can then start operating powerfully as your future self, while at the same time continuously appreciating your present and your former self. So I just think that that's a really more powerful approach, and it starts to lay the foundation of 10x and 2x. But where do you want to go with that?